I was writing with some concern about what now gets labeled feminism on campuses, which has to do with, I think, dialing back a lot of progress women in particular have made about establishing ourselves as consenting adults.
Laura Kipnis is a professor of communications at Northwestern University and author most recently of Men, an Ongoing Investigation, in which she asked the perhaps subversive question of what do men want. Laura Kipnis, thank you for joining Reason TV.
Hi.
We will talk about your book in a second, but let's first talk about your perhaps unlikely new role as poster child of the anti-campus political correctness movement. Earlier this year, you write an essay about sexual paranoia in academia for Chronicles of Higher Education, in which you criticize the sort of administrative changes, regulatory, and even social changes at the University at Northwestern as regards sexual assault and just sexism in general. And then the reaction goes bananas. There are protests, and eventually even 2 students filed a Title IX complaint against the words that you wrote, yes, saying that it was somehow going to stifle a chilling effect on their lives here. When this all happened, the reaction, did you at least have a chance to pause and high-five yourself for having your theory proved correct, or did it go straight to the Kafkaesque nightmare?
Well, I should go back a bit and say that I was writing in this article as a feminist, and I was writing with some concern about what now gets labeled feminism on campuses, which has to do with, I think, dialing back a lot of progress women in particular have made about establishing ourselves as consenting adults. So a lot of the impetus of these new campus codes is to take consent away from women and students and put it in the hands of administrators. So I was, writing against this wave of new regulation, particularly the codes governing professors and students dating. So what happened then was students staged this protest carrying mattresses and pillows and carrying a petition to the president's office. But the whole thing is that the mattress had become a symbol at Columbia, as everyone knows, having to do with student-on-student sexual assault. And I had written nothing on that subject. So when I first saw this photo of students carrying mattresses, I was kind of befuddled because it did seem symbolically incoherent to me. But I also did think, I'm not sure I quite high-fived myself, but I did think this wasn't going to end up looking good for the students. So I think that proved to be true.
Did it kind of suggest to you that maybe the problem in the way that we talk about it and our changing rules is worse than you thought?
It did prove what I had said. I thought, more than I could have imagined, because by carrying this petition to the president's office asking for me to be censured for having written an article, asking the administration to protect them from, what I can only think is a kind of very slight umbrage of somebody having written something that they don't agree with. I mean, yes, it did prove one of the points I was making, which was that this increase in these codes and regulations is increasing students' own sense of vulnerability, so that everything becomes an injury. And the question I asked was, how does this leave them after graduation to cope with, what happens out in the world where there aren't administrators to protect us from, minor injuries?
Talk about a little bit about what you described as the inquisition that happened afterwards. A Title IX investigation that sounds like gobbledygook for those of us who haven't been on a college campus really for 25 years. They haul you in, you don't have access to a lawyer, but you can have a support person. Is that like a support animal or something? What happens there? Talk us through the due process of what happened to you next.
Well, I had written a couple of paragraphs in the first article about this situation that was going on our campus about a professor who had been accused of sexual misconduct with 2 students. And I made brief reference, there were 2 cases, there was one of an undergrad and one of a graduate student, and I had made very brief reference to the graduate student's case, like by brief I mean 7 or 8 words. So when I found out, I got this letter from the Title IX office that complaints had been filed against me, under Title IX, and I, like everyone else, thought, well, doesn't this have to do with like gender discrimination or sexual harassment? I wasn't that familiar with it, and I didn't see how it could apply to an article. and I was being charged with retaliation, and I didn't see how I could be charged with retaliation if I hadn't committed some sexual misconduct against somebody in the first place that I'd been charged with. So the whole thing was very baffling, and in many ways it is still baffling. It's one of the things I want to do is learn more about Title IX. So this emanates from the Department of Education and the Office of Civil Rights, and all campuses that get any kind of federal funding have to stay in compliance with Title IX regulations, which are very vague, or they risk losing federal funding. So of course, Northwestern is in the position, if anybody files a complaint, to jump into gear and pursue this investigation. So that's kind of what happened. And yes, I was allowed to have a faculty support person, not a lawyer.
And that was the first time to even hear what the case was against you at that moment, and that's the moment that you also had to respond to it?
The procedures are, also baffling, and I don't know if they're written down somewhere. I found them out as I went along. Like I said, can I have a lawyer? No, you can't have a lawyer. They wanted me to show up to a meeting, and they would tell me the charges. They wouldn't put the charges in writing. So they wanted me to show up, so they would tell me the charges in person and then have me respond to questions. So I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I want the charges in writing, and then I will think about them, and then I will show up to a meeting where I'll answer questions. So we went back and forth about this. I never got the charges in writing. We finally had a Skype session where they told me the charges, verbally, and I tried to type them because I have very bad handwriting and I didn't trust my ability. So instead I have these wildly mistyped notes where it lists these charges. So I didn't answer questions in that Skype session, but then I had a meeting with them that lasted 3 hours. There were the university brought in 2 outside investigators from a firm in another Midwestern city, flew them in to conduct this investigation that went on for 72 days over essentially 7 words in this article.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's where I guess the Kafkaesque, to be cliche, that's where the Kafkaesque part of it, happened.
I mean, it just seems like an appalling waste of time and money for something that should be free speech in a place that we, in theory, believe are bastions of free speech.
I was trying to estimate how much this cost, and in the end, what they came up with were 2 60-page single-spaced reports, and additionally 2 abridged reports that were 5 pages each, single-spaced. So I thought it's got to be like 50 to 100 grand for this. And I mean, they interviewed maybe 8 or 9 different people for the process. So I mean, that was a lot of person hours.
Let's talk a little bit about kind of more the theme of the article a bit. You are saying that sort of modern feminism is a feminism that's hijacked by melodrama, that there's sort of an obsession with helpless victims and these and kind of like super powerful predators. How did that happen? How did we get to that point from feminism that those of us who are older kind of remember, which was more about kind of agency and empowerment? What happened?
Yeah, that was the feminism that I came of age with, and I'm still formed by. I mean, there have always been these contests among different forms of feminism, and there was a version that got called radical feminism early on, although it's what I would say is the more conservative version, the more right-wing version, that was associated with people like Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, and it was, they were making a push against pornography. And so there was this legal case that got made by McKinnon, who's a law professor, that words constitute like harmful actions. So they were trying to define speech itself as potentially not just kind of a path to violence, but as a form of violence. And even though I'm not sure people actually read McKinnon and Dworkin now, I mean, I still do. And in the Men book, one of the chapters is on Dworkin. She's, I think, a fascinating figure. But I do think that version or tendency in feminism kind of got mushed together with other sorts of tendencies, say what on campuses is called identity politics, this idea of marginalization, this kind of privileging of marginal subjects and various forms of oppression, and I'm not, I can't, I'm somebody on the left. I mean, there's a lot about minority, issues in the history of America and the history of American campuses and all of that I think has to be addressed. But some of the forms it's taking and this culture of injury that has developed, I do not think are the right ways of addressing, particularly when it comes to women's situation.
Now, obviously your case and the case of people who've suffered more kind of injury in process on campus are interesting and kind of outrageous on their own. For the unfeeling bastards who are nowhere near academia and don't personally care about you, how does this trend on college campuses having to do with this kind of melding of identity politics plus sort of speech? I mean, there's been a lot of people making comments about not going on college campuses to do comedy anymore, the sense that the students are being infantilized. How is that affecting the rest of us who are nowhere near a college campus?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there's this term rape culture that gets pushed around now, and I mean, I got accused of fostering rape culture. And all of this stuff is leading to more regulation. I mean, not just on campuses, but workplaces. All the kinds of anti-consensual relations, things that happen in businesses now, corporate culture, is also regulated by these kinds of things. And to some degree, it addresses what absolutely were abuses of power in the past, particularly by men in positions of power toward subordinates. But, it's not just, don't think of academia as existing in isolation. I mean, it's a vast part of the culture, and, people who go to colleges get out of college and, enter the real world and do things and make laws, for example, or, other kinds of workplace regulations. So I can't think that it doesn't affect everyone or that academia is some, isolated situation.
You talk about in your book about kind of the modern male as being sort of, or at least rumored to be kind of anti-libidinous. They're more sad sacks. How would you describe the changes of the modern male right now to, say, 20 or 30 years ago? What caused those changes in your estimation?
Well, I'm not the one who's going to blame feminists for male listlessness, although I certainly know that, particularly online, there is a lot of that kind of blame going on. I mean, I do think that there's like a kind of vast re-juggling of gender roles, and it's, I think, in process, and I think that that combined with like certain kinds of economic insults to men, like the loss of the breadwinner role, the loss of, job security, the family wage, all of that, women entering the workforce. I mean, I do think that there's a period of uncertainty that has all sorts of psychological effects on men. And how can that not affect relations, romantic, sexual, libidinal, all of that?
Is it just too complicated to assess, or is it an improvement? I mean, I grew up hanging out with a lot of new left people who are all very, sexually advanced and all this kind of stuff, which just meant they got to grab more asses than the old Archie Bunker crusts. Is the new listless male at least better behaved than the, progressive males of the 70s?
If you read somebody like Hannah Rosen, who wrote the book The End of Men, I mean, men have really been kicked in the, whatever part of the anatomy you want to specify, by the economy. So, I don't think that's good for anyone. And I mean, I'm somebody who wrote in a previous book called The Female Thing, I mean, that I think a lot of what gets called improvement in women's wages has come at the expense of men, because those are measured as percentages. So if women are now making like 72% of the male wage instead of 70, it's because male wages have declined. So, I do think all of that stuff has to be looked at.
Let's talk about one of your final chapters, The Women Who Hate Men, where you talk about Andrea Dworkin, who you mentioned earlier, but also Larry Flynt, and you kind of share their sense of disgust at the sex act. Can you talk about these unlikely pair and what that means for all of us as we talk and think about the various gender wars and things?
The first essay in the book is about Larry Flynt, who I have the pleasure of meeting a couple of times. I guess I met him once and interviewed him on the phone a few other times, because what happened, I had written a long time ago an essay about Hustler called Desire and Disgust. And I was very interested in the class politics of Hustler magazine. And this, in a way, was my taking aim at Dworkin and McKinnon and other anti-porn feminists who I thought neglected other issues in pornography like class. So I started reading Hustler, which was actually kind of difficult as a kind of proper bourgeois, woman. It really is disgusting. But I became very interested in the ways it used disgust as a political tactic. So I wrote this essay, which somehow Larry Flynn ended up reading. His ghostwriter had given him a copy. And so I ended up meeting him and spending some time with him. And then when his autobiography came out, he actually used stuff from my essay and put it in the first person as though he had thought of it, So I was both flattered, I thought, okay, well, I guess I got it right. Or, as I said when I wrote more about him, I think he has this kind of sense of roving identity as a bit of a scavenger, and he'll be whatever anybody wants him to be, including a First Amendment hero. But I opened the book with Larry and my kind of encounters with him and feelings about him, and in a way that I think he sort of changed me. Reading Hustler and meeting him and thinking about him made me have to be sort of cognizant of my own, the ways that disgust kind of governs, I think, often feminine or female sensibility, So it was an interesting thought experiment. But then the last chapter was about Dworkin, Hustler had taken off after Dworkin on many occasions, and she sued them, and it led to a very important Supreme Court decision about the expansion of critical speech. So Larry did have this, I think, vast effect on American culture. But so there's a coda in the end where I talk about this sort of meeting via the courts, or this lawsuit between these unlikely figures who are both in their different ways motivated by sexual disgust.
That's a fascinating a match that wouldn't necessarily occur to everybody.
Yeah.
Final thought about your campus travails here. The reaction to it, the reaction to your case, which you've written about again for Chronicles of Higher Education. Does it give you hope? Does it give you anti-hope? Where do you think we're going from here in the great kind of campus speech wars?
Well, one of the things that happened after the Title IX essay came out, the second one, is I started getting this slew of email from people who'd also been brought up on Title IX charges, or they implied that they were. A lot of people said, well, something like that happened to me, but I can't really talk about it.
Yeah, did you have a gag order on your
It says something like, we expect you to keep this confidential. So I wouldn't say it was a gag order, and as I investigated, I couldn't find, was there some punishment if you didn't? So I just decided to go for it and expose it. And I did write the piece before the process had been finalized, because they were delaying a verdict on me. So in fact, the verdict came out later in the day that the piece went online. I'm not sure that there was a connection. So I do think I will try to write more about the process and try to get more information from other people that have been through it, because there are these secret tribunals going on that no one knows about and people are afraid to talk about. And I think that a lot of the people who've been brought up on charges are more reluctant to talk about it because I don't think they feel they're on as firm ground as I was. I mean, I was brought up over an article. If you're brought up because you were dating one of your students, you're less likely to want to come forward. But this is going on in secret, and I do think it's worth knowing about it. I think there should be more transparency. So I do wonder if people are going to start to push back more against this or go public, partly because, and I'm not trying to make myself into like a, hero of the Title IX process, but I did feel like I was in firmer ground going forward, partly because I'm tenured. So I think maybe more people will start to come forward.
Well, let's certainly hope so. Laura Kipnis, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
For Reason TV, I am Matt Welch. Theory proved correct, or did it go straight to the Kafkaesque nightmare?
Well, I should go back a bit and say that I was writing in this article as a feminist, and I was writing with some concern about what now gets labeled feminism on campuses, which has to do with, I think, dialing back a lot of progress women in particular have made about establishing ourselves as consenting adults. So a lot of the impetus of these new campus codes is to take consent away from women and students and put it in the hands of administrators. So I was, writing against this wave of new regulation, particularly the codes governing professors and students dating. So what happened then was students staged this protest carrying mattresses and pillows and carrying a petition to the president's office. But the whole thing is that the mattress had become a symbol.
The university at Northwestern as regards sexual assault and just sexism in general. And then the reaction goes bananas. There are protests, and eventually even 2 students filed a Title IX complaint against the words that you wrote, yes, saying that it was somehow going to stifle a chilling effect on their lives here. When this all happened, the reaction, did you at least have a chance to pause and high-five yourself for having your...
I was writing with some concern about what now gets labeled feminism on campuses, which has to do with, I think, dialing back a lot of progress women in particular have made about establishing ourselves as consenting adults.
Laura Kipnis is a professor of communications at Northwestern University and author most recently of Men, an Ongoing Investigation, in which she asked the perhaps subversive question of what do men want. Laura Kipnis, thank you for joining Reason TV.
Hi.
We will talk about your book in a second, but let's first talk about your perhaps unlikely new role as poster child of the anti-campus political correctness movement. Earlier this year, you write an essay about sexual paranoia in academia for Chronicles of Higher Education, in which you criticize the sort of administrative changes, regulatory, and even social changes at